So, as you heard, my name is Mark Dalglish, and I'm really excited to be here tonight, especially because this is like a brand new talk for me, brand new topic, something that I'm planning to write more about and talk more about soon. But this is very much you getting the early draft of my thinking and some of my initial thoughts. So I'm definitely keen, more so than normal, to get your feedback, because that will feed directly into what I write about, what I talk about. So any questions you have, any thoughts, any feedback, I would love to hear it. So during the break afterwards, I'll be hanging around after the end of the meetup as well. So please do come and talk to me. So that means that a lot of the demos, whereas typically I'd normally try and pre-record them, I'm going to do a live demo. You might prefer that, so we'll see how it goes. I'm playing with fate. But let's kick on with it. So as you heard, I'm from Seek, and at Seek there I've been working in the DesignOps space for a while. I work on our shared front-end tooling. There's a number of projects there that fit under that category, one of which is our design system, Seek Style Guide. You may also be aware of me from my work on the dev side with CSS modules. It's a way of scoping CSS to React components, and in a lot of ways it very much is the technical foundation that allowed us to build our design system. The old way that we did CSS just did not scale, does not lend itself to building a design system. So yeah, we were definitely part of that initial wave of trying to figure out how do we bring design to the world of components and the React community in general. So as a bit of a recap of what I was talking about last time I was here, I was talking about HTML SketchUp CLI, and of course that's built on top of HTML SketchUp. I'll go quickly over what that is, because it sort of provides the background of the next level of thinking in this space for me. So HTML SketchUp CLI for us is about trying to bridge our component library back into the world of design. So it's a tool, it's a command line utility that you can run where you can point it at an HTML file or URL, and then it will write out to disk some JSON files that we can then import into Sketch via a plugin called HTML SketchUp. So this is a page on our style guide. It's kind of a hidden route that you can find. It's public if you want to look at it. It's sketch-exports. And what it does is it actually prints out every single component in our system in a variety of states. The frame rate's not great, but if you can catch it, well, you can see it now. The names of the symbols have slashes in them, which means that in Sketch, they become nested menus. So what we do is we take all the hard work that we're pouring into code, being the source of truth in our design system. How do we get that work back into the design flow? All of these get imported into Sketch and saved as part of our Sketch library that designers consume. We put that on a shared drive, and all of our designers open that file, add it as a library, and then any file that they open, they now have access to that Sketch library. So from a designer's perspective, what that looks like is something like this. So they're opening the Seek Style Guide. This is sped up slightly. They're opening the Seek Style Guide library menu inside of Sketch, and they're pulling in header, footer, text nodes, components, and overriding the text and so on. And what's great, of course, is that, as I've sort of alluded to earlier, all of this loops back to our design system, where all of the work we put into our React components can flow back into the designer's next round of work. Anything that's been defined already in code, the designer doesn't have to recreate. If the code changes, which of course it does, the Sketch library stays up to date automatically. So we never have to deal with the problem that we used to have, where the code and the Sketch assets were sort of these separate silos that we had to manually keep in sync. The idea is that the design system is a source, as code is a source of truth. That's what runs in production, and that is automatically fed back into the next round of design. So this obviously for us is an important step forward. It gets rid of one of the massive divisions between developers and designers. It gets us towards this vision that was sort of talked about at the start of the meetup, which is that the gap between design and development should be as close to zero as possible. And that means in this case that there should be one source of truth for what our components look like, and we should be referencing that together. But there's a problem with this model. As great as it is, and as important of a step forward it is for us, there are some significant problems with this entire model, which I think our industry is obviously starting to face. The big issue ultimately comes down to the fact that it's still pretty unconstrained. Constraints are a very important part of the design process, I think, particularly when you're working at large scales with lots of projects like we have at a company like Seek. Constraints are a good thing, and we're kind of lacking them in this environment now that we're going down the road of design systems. So there's a few different ways that we're unconstrained. The first one is there's unconstrained layout. And by that, I mean that you can literally drag and drop anything, anywhere. You can just go crazy. Now, that could be a good or bad thing, depending on where you are in the design process. But I think for a lot of design work, where you're just trying to create another screen on your site that looks more or less like other screens, this sort of freedom is kind of dangerous, I think. It's really hard to rein this in. So I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about, but just to prove the point. So here's Sketch. I've got a couple of artboards here. Let's zoom in on this iPhone SE size one. So this is kind of what it looks like, right? I've got my Seek Style Guide library, and I can come in here, and like you saw before, but obviously at normal speed, I can pull in my header, and I can choose whether I want Australia or New Zealand. I can choose authenticated on mobile, and it's the right size for that. So I can drop that in there like so. But, oh, Zoom is in the way. So what I've got over here is I can override the name, that sort of thing. So that's all pretty easy. Where it gets tricky, of course, is like if I go in and put a text field, oops, wrong size. Well, that's already part of the problem. I have to remember to keep picking the same size. Text field, standard, mobile, drop that in there. You can already see there's a bit of a problem where, you know, where does it actually sit? Now, this is a bit easier to deal with in the sense that it's, as long as I align it to the center, it's more or less correct. But, you know, if I do something like drop an icon in here, so let's pull in an icon, and we'll say, I'm going to drop an arrow icon here, standard size on mobile. It's like, I can just put this wherever. And typically that's not really how you want to design sites at scale. Like there's rules about where things sit and why. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, of course, which I'm sure you all experience on a regular basis, which is as you build up these designs full of arbitrary layout decisions, and then that gets handed to a developer, they've now got to figure out, how does this map to reality? Do we actually have components for these layouts? Are these deliberate deviations for the system or accidental? Who do I need to talk to figure it out? It makes for a hard handover process, even in a world where you've done all this effort, right, to get all of your design system code work back into Sketch. The second big problem is unconstrained responsive design. So even if you get the layout more or less correct, because as long as you make it look like other pages, you're going to be okay. But the challenge in this world is that mobile and desktop can too easily be radically different from each other. So one of the big things that we try to do with our component system is to bake in responsive design. So each discrete component that you use internally has its own rules for how it should lay out across desktop and mobile. So from a developer's standpoint, they drop in a single component, they can resize that window and they'll get the expected behavior. That, of course, is not what we see in an environment like Sketch. So, you know, I can drop, let me get rid of that icon. Now I can do the same thing, of course, with the header. Something as simple as the header is quite easy. If I drop in the header on desktop, I get the appropriately sized desktop version. That one's quite straightforward. But if I start to go further, just as a contrived example, I could use a text area. I could say, hey, I've got more room on desktop. I'm going to use a text area. But our component doesn't work that way, right? Like as a developer now, they've got this problem of, you've actually given me two different websites. Like if you had used the same component, that'd be easy enough. But right now you're already starting to basically give me two different designs. And that, again, creates that friction around that handoff point between design and dev, or ideally not a handoff point. But if it is a handoff point, this is one of those points we get the friction, right? And we see this in practice, right? A developer will look at these two different artboards and say, I'm actually not sure how to build this save for building two different sites with a bunch of branching logic between them. And that kind of defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do with responsive design, which is create this one unified design that scales. So that's a real challenge for us. Like I said, we see this in practice even at companies like Seek at scale. The third problem that we see quite regularly is unconstrained component creation. And by that, I mean any component can be modified at any time, and there's really no guidance to the developer like what's going on here. So again, if we jump over to Sketch, as a designer, I might look at this and say, you know what, this label, I'm going to unlink from my library. Oops, let's go back. Sorry. Detach from symbol. I'm going to edit this, and right now it's medium weight, but you know what, I'm going to make it light because I really like light text. And I'm going to grab this counter here, and I feel like it should be maybe at the top right instead. Let's do that. And that all seems easy enough, right? But now I give it to the developer and they're going, that's actually not what the component looks like. So now what do you want me to do? Are you actually proposing a wholesale change to our system? Are you proposing that there's a new option for the text area? And if so, what is the option called? What's the values? Like there's a whole conversation that's often missing here. And the challenge, of course, is that given that design often happens at the page scale, what we see in practice is a lot of these micro redesigns of the components just happen all over the design. Things get moved around, things get changed, often just at the whim of the person designing it without really again, lacking those constraints of realizing that all these things are really proposals of a change to the system. In practice, what can happen is the developer is your last line of defense against this kind of thing. They're the ones saying, I don't know what to do with this. And you're really at the mercy of the temperament of that developer. Often we see some teams where developers are not as close to design. They'll just say, yeah, whatever, I'll hack my way around it. And that's actually not what they should say. If you're trying to do design systems properly, they should be pushing back on the designer and saying, I need you to clarify what's going on here. So this is a real problem. Like I said, all of these are real problems we see in practice with this type of design tool and this type of workflow. And the final problem, I guess, and it's sort of related to everything we just talked about, is that there is unconstrained communication here. And by that, what I mean is that the developers, when they see this design, they're left looking at it, wondering, what is this design even made out of? You know, for someone like me who works on a design system, it's very easy to look at a picture made up of these components and go, yeah, I know what all this stuff is. That makes sense. But imagine a developer got hired to seek, they've just started tomorrow, they get handed a full design with one of these. What is it made out of? There is zero guidance, it's just a picture. And as much as we've done all the hard work to map it to the right components and everything's coming from the source of truth, even if the design was done perfectly, like the responsive design was 100% correct, none of the components have been changed, you're still left with this problem that the developer just has a picture. They can't click on it and say, what was the name of the component? In this case, maybe if they have Sketch, they could make some sense out of it, but it's definitely not perfect. What they don't see is what options were provided and so on. So what should we do about this? This is no secret that this is a problem. I think a lot of, once you get on that journey towards design systems, you start to feel this problem more and more acutely, and there are products out there that are trying to deal with this. A lot of people are really realizing that what we need is an entirely new paradigm when it comes to how we design in the world of design systems. We need to design with components as a first-class citizen in our design tools, not as sort of a hack to try and retrofit into old tools. So the most obvious tool in this space that's getting all the hype, it's by far not the only one. I wouldn't even say it's my favorite, but it's the most well-known one, is FramerX. I've had a little bit of a play with this. This is a really great tool that's trying to get at this problem, which is that bringing components from code back into the design tool should not be an afterthought. It shouldn't be a hack. It shouldn't be this weird science experiment. It should actually be a normal part of design in this day and age. And this is what it looks like. So on the left there, you've got your components. All of those components are built with React. They have their own store, so you can install component kits. They have a bunch of standard ones too, like iOS components and material design. And of course, you can publish your own, and that's what people have been doing. So your company can publish your own component library to the Framer store and start using it in your own designs. And that workflow that we just saw with Sketch is now not, like I said, not this weird hack that some people are doing. It's actually a first-class part of this tool. But it still has its problems. I won't go into it now. If you want to talk to me after the break, what my concerns with FramerX, please do. But the key takeaway here with tools like FramerX, and the other ones we're seeing, is that components are the new design API at scale. This is to me, what design systems are all about. It's about trying to figure out what is the contract between the design phase, the build phase, and how do we get that synchronized so that we're actually speaking the same language. So that when we talk to each other, we're not talking cross paths, so that when someone goes to build the design, they actually can point to the same language that you've used at the design phase, use the same language at build time. So as developers, myself being a developer, but as companies as well, as entire teams, how do we force ourselves to think component first? As developers, we're very used to hacking our way around things, writing custom CSS left and right. And that works fine in the development world, but once you get into the world of these design tools, everything needs to be a component for it to be surfaced in something like frameworks. If every day when I'm building something, I have to keep reaching for the escape hatches and writing custom CSS, it means that our framer X library in this case is incomplete. It actually needs some more work done to it. And so the developers now need to uphold their end of the bargain here, which is to make sure that our component libraries are really focused on getting components, that component API solid and full of enough features that you can actually build proper designs. Now, one of the ways that I've been trying to tackle this is what we call the Sandbox in Seek Style Guide. So we actually have a page on the Style Guide website that I threw together a while ago, where it's actually an in-browser code editor at the bottom. But the catch is that you don't have to write a full application. You don't even have to write a full React component. You literally just write JSX. And for those of you who don't know, JSX is the way that you write the markup in a React application. So it's JavaScript that kind of looks like XML, kind of looks like HTML. Anytime you see a capital letter at the start of one of those tags, it means that it's one of our components. So you can see here, in this case, it's entirely made out of components from our system. You can see the header, page block, section, text, a cited layout, card, text field, and the different options for those. And so as a developer or even as a designer who can work their way around this or pairing with a developer, this is a really fluid environment to quickly start to prototype things out of the actual materials that we're going to build with. And this has been a really valuable tool for us, especially given, like I said, responsive design is a big thing for us, and we can show what this layout looks like across the different screen sizes live as you type in the browser. And this, like I said, this has been hugely valuable for us. What I'm excited about with this is it's starting to introduce kind of a different take on this problem. A lot of these other design tools, they're trying to bring components to a more classical design tool, and there's definitely a place for that. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to experiment with this idea of coming at it the other way. How do we create a code-oriented design environment? Like first and foremost, I want to think of this as a design tool, but it's powered by code. And what does that look like? And I'm definitely trying to see where that takes me. So in the case of Seek, how we've been using it ourselves, it's been valuable for a number of reasons. One, it lets us design in the final medium. Now, design is a spectrum, of course, it's a process. In this case, what I'm referring to is generally when a visual designer or a UXer has come up with a screen, something that they've either done on paper or in Sketch, something along those lines, something a little more freeform, a little less constrained, like we talked about earlier. When you get to that point where it's like, no, actually, we want to start to effectively spec out, like, what are we actually going to ship? This is the point at which this tool becomes really valuable, because you can sit down, designer, developer as a pair, try and translate the work into components and see how far you get. Like how close can I get to your design out of the stock standard components? And that's what gives you that feedback of like, how close are we to being able to service this and what are the gaps? It means that you can create quick mockups and prototypes. It is actually really fast to work with, particularly if you're familiar with the components. From a point of view of someone who's working on the design system, I kind of alluded to it earlier, but this has been a fundamentally massive step forward for us to try out new ways of evaluating the flexibility of our design system. So components in isolation is one thing, but a tool like this lets you recombine them, rearrange them, and start to get a feel for how flexible the system is when everything comes together. This has been one of the ways in which I've been able to evaluate additions to the system. As people propose new components, changes to components, we can start to get a feel for, well, what does that new component feel like if I put it in this context or that context? What happens if I put it above another component? What's the white space between them? Is it what I expect? If not, why not? You can start to have those conversations. It's actually really hard when you only ever look at a component purely in isolation. You want to get a feel for it as part of a whole. And one of the most exciting things for me is it wasn't there at the beginning, but we quickly realized that people were wanting to share their work. So they'd code up a bit of UI, and they might have some questions about it. Maybe they've even found a bug. We've seen that happen before. And they want to copy and paste their work to someone. They would have to copy the code and Slack it to someone and basically say, hey, can you go to the Sandbox and paste this code in there? What we do now is we actually live sync the code into the URL, so you can just copy and paste the URL, send them a link. and that will populate the code automatically, which is pretty cool. Now, I found that as a tool for us, this was way too useful not to share. We built this as an internal solution, again, as part of our design system website, but this clearly had legs outside of Seek and really needed to be freed from that. So I'm here today to show you what I've been working on, and that's a project called Playroom. Now, this is already live. We've open sourced this just last week. So you can install this from NPM, the Node Package Manager, Playroom. It's a little command line utility that, like all good JavaScript command line utilities, has its own config file. We've probably got about 30 of those in every project now. So here's another one. And you provide your components, your themes, if you have those. You can wrap each frame in its own component, which I might go into later. You customize the widths. You can provide example code. And so what this lets you do is you can plug in your own design system, plug in your own components. If it's a themable system, you can plug in those themes. You can customize what size frames you want. And then you can build your own sandbox like you saw before. So this is the final version. Well, final as in what it looks like now. So I've changed the visual styling a bit. Now that it's not hard-coded into Seek's website, I realized it kind of needed to look a little more like a traditional design tool so that it can kind of fit with whatever look and feel you have. So I've blatantly ripped off the look and feel of Sketch, which is to say this gray background is literally the same gray background that you have in Sketch. Each of those frames is kind of trying to feel a bit more like an artboard like you see in Sketch. In the corner of each pseudo artboard there, you've got the size of the frame. So we've got 320, 375, 768 there. You can scroll horizontally and see the different ones. And the code pane at the bottom there is now got a white background, a little nicer on the eyes. But otherwise, it's the same idea. So what I'll do is I'll give you a live, rather than just a picture, I can give you the live demo. Let's see. There you go. So here's the live version. Couldn't tell the difference. So I'm going to start again and show you kind of what the editing experience is like. The frame rate's a bit awful here, so hopefully it holds up okay. So if you saw my tweet about talking tonight, I said that I was going to announce some new features. I've literally added this one major new feature in the last couple of days, which is it now it has autocomplete for the component names and the options for the components. So that's a much nicer experience. So as soon as I do an open, what do you call it, angle bracket there, it's already suggesting to me what components are available in Seek Style Guide. So I've got alert, decided layout, auto suggest. I can scroll through this list. And so I'm going to start off with the header, like that. And I can add a footer, same thing. The header is customizable. Here are the options. So I can actually change the locale to be AU or NZ. So let's go with NZ. I can change my authentication status to be any one of these three: authenticated, unauthenticated, pending. So I can actually see like what does my app look like while it's sort of waiting to log me in. It shows these dots bouncing here. But if we change that to authenticated, I'm now signed in. So I can see my profile, my sign out link is there, for example. I can change the username to be Mark and it updates live as I type. And I can start to do things like add a, what am I going to do? Let's add a card, add a section, add some text, hero. Let's say sign in. We'll do the class. I always go for the sign in form. We have a special version of section provides our white space around a piece of content, including the gutters, standard gutter sizes. But we also have a section header, which you can see the difference there is quite significant. At the top of the page, it adds a bit more white space at the top, a little bit more at the bottom. Actually, typically I don't tend to wrap that in a card, so let's get rid of that. And from here I can say, now we'll add a card. This is a pattern we often do where we have a heading outside of a card, then we have a card below it. Have to add another section within the card. And inside of that, I'm going to add a text field. So right away, I've got a text field rendering there. It needs a label. Equals email address. I can add a password field. Now these are live editable fields. Now that password field is not quite right, so let's change that to type password if we care about that sort of thing. There you go. So you've got a password field, and just to finish it off, we can add a button group with a button. Well, let's add a couple of buttons. Color equals pink. Sign in. And we'll go transparent. We'll go with cancel. And so you can see that our mobile layout's looking pretty finalized already. Now this is an easy one to do because it's a very standard layout. But that's kind of the point, is if you are doing standard layouts that are built out of things that are from the system, we're trying to get an environment where you can experiment and build up a design quite quickly. But it's quite telling that you can see that as I scroll across, it's not very responsive. I won't solve it now. But what I'm kind of missing is some kind of container to constrain the width on larger screens. So there are components that I can pull out here. And again, this is where the pairing of design and development is really useful, to have someone kind of go, yeah, we have components for dealing with this sort of problem. You know, is this the right one for the job? What options shall I give it? And how closely is it matching the design? But you can see that every time you make a design decision, you can see how it cascades across everything. Now, at Seek, I'm actually working on multiple design systems. I haven't talked about this much publicly, but we're working on a new system called Braid. So Seek Style Guide, for the longest time, we wanted to give it a brand. We never had a good excuse. Now we do for our new system. And that's because, let me show you quickly. Braid, this is our new system. It's very, very early. The reason we need a new system is because if you're not aware, I didn't know until I worked at Seek. Seek's actually a group of companies. They own a lot of companies around the world. And they've largely been running independently in terms of design and development. But we're reaching that tipping point where it's just not the way to go for us anymore. We need to start to pull our efforts together and start to bring projects that are the same across regions into a single code basis with single designs, more or less. And so that's what Braid's trying to achieve. It's now a themable design system. So you can see here that for an alert, for example, we've got a few different themes. We have a wireframe theme, which is effectively a rebranding of the Braid theme. We've got Job Street, which is one of our brands, Seek Asia and Seek ANZ, and there's more to come. And so this provides us a way to centralize the work of our design system, centralize our design language, have it themable in a way that from a development standpoint, you use these components, you use the standard options, and it will theme accordingly based on the rules that were agreed upon by the corresponding design teams. So it actually puts a lot more emphasis on the design teams collaborating and agreeing more on a design language than we've had before. So for me as a design systems fan, this has been great for us. It's really forcing us to do the right thing. But it also creates an interesting challenge. Again, if we talked about the problems with unconstrained design before, we've got an extra dimension now, which is we've got unconstrained design across themes. So the whole point of this move for us is to consolidate efforts and have a single source of truth for what a page looks like, regardless of screen size and theme. And so if I've got an artboard for every screen size and an artboard for every theme, and it's a matrix of designs, and every one of those designs can be radically different, that starts to become that much more of a problem. So we need the model that we're proposing here with Playroom is actually much more appropriate for this sort of problem space. So what we're doing is, and what really motivated the need for us to pull Playroom, as we call it now, out of Seek Style Guide and give it its own brand, its own life outside of that, is so that we could reuse the concept for Braid and start to add more features to it. So this is what it looks like when you've got multiple themes, which is what we're dealing with here. So now for every screen size that you configure, you actually see every theme as well. So every design decision you make in the JSX at the bottom of the screen, you'll see reflected in those different viewports at the top. So I will show you a live demo of that as well. This is the live version here. And again, it's that same experience where it's suggesting what components I can use and what their options are. Here I'm adding a checklist card to the screen, which doesn't show much yet. I can add a checkbox, and if I add another checkbox, you can see we get a divider between them. There's nothing in the checkbox yet, so I can add a label. Let's say checkbox 1, and we'll go with checkbox 2. And one of the things that's a little annoying is that you have to turn off what we call the message, which is we reserve a space for the error message at the bottom of a checkbox so that on a form, when you fill it out and you hit submit, if there's errors, the form suddenly doesn't double in height. We try to keep it to the same height. The only annoying thing then is it means if you're dealing with something that never shows error messages, you have to explicitly turn them off. But just as a side note, that's actually one of the benefits I think of this tool is when you're sitting with a designer, you can start to surface like, this is actually annoying for me to write this all the time. Have I actually got this right, that this is how we think about it? Because I'd like to not be annoyed all the time. I want this API to be as smooth as possible, even during this sort of design phase. So you can see here, I'm starting to lay out a couple of checkboxes in our list. Let's add a couple more for good measure. Go 3 and 4. And you can see that the sizing between them is actually quite different. So each of our themes, it's not just a color swap. It's actually the entire grid system and typography is changing out. So the height of elements is just completely all over the place across the different brands. In an ideal world, if you're starting from scratch, you probably wouldn't deliberately design them to be so different, but that's the world that we're living in. And this system is built to handle that. So you can see how that from a design perspective, being able to see how your decisions cascade across different grid systems and different typography, it's actually really hard to see how you would do an accurate job otherwise. And so for each of these, you can say, let's say this one's checked. So all of those are checked now, and you can see the checkbox colors are different. We have different formats and colors across the different brands. And we have this convention now in Braid, which is that when a checkbox is checked, the content that's nested inside of it as children becomes visible. So if I put a little hello world message in there, so you can see this text that's nested within the checkbox is now visible. But if the user was to uncheck it, it disappears. So that gives us a nice, easy way to expand and collapse content within checkboxes. So yeah, that gives you a sense of, what does it look like when you've got not just different screen sizes, but different themes as well, which is a huge requirement for us now. Where are we? There we go. Now, it probably goes without saying, but this is very early. Like I said, it was just open source last week, and there's plenty of room for improvement. But what's really cool is I find that the more I show it to people, and especially the more that they start to play with it and try it out, the ideas just start flowing. There's so much potential in this tool. I'm really excited about it. So the first thing, this is just a short list of things that I want to add, but it's by no means exhaustive. The first one is, I actually had to change the slide today. It used to just say like autocomplete for JSX, but we've done that. We have it. I want to make it better though. It's not as good as it could be, but it's definitely far enough along that you can be really productive with it, but it needs to be better. Those of you who are familiar with Prettier, it's a JavaScript tool that will auto-format the code for you. That's really useful, I think, when you're trying to work fast, which is you spend less time manually trying to align things and make the code pretty. If you hit Command S, like your muscle memory for saving, it should just like make the code beautiful for you. That would save me a lot of time, I know that. There's other tools that in something like a Chrome developer tools, you kind of take for granted that we're lacking here, which is highlighting elements when you hover on the code or something similar. So one thing I find that's tricky with this model is there's this separation between you're editing the code and what you're looking at is up here. And the longer the code gets, the harder it is to sort of map, what is this line I'm editing? Like, where is that up on the screen? And that's where you really feel the difference between more traditional design tools that have that sort of direct manipulation, where you're literally prodding at the UI elements and changing them directly. This is a little more indirect. So features like this go a long way to making up for that gap. So it's like giving you that sense of direct manipulation, even if you're editing the code. You feel like you're editing that thing that's highlighted in yellow. The other thing I think that's really valuable, which is kind of bringing forward what we've done in Sketch into this code environment, which is to say, if you're using Sketch and you're using our library, what's really nice about it is we've kind of got these higher level pre-canned examples. So just to quickly show you what I mean, if I jump over to Sketch, I can insert, if we're on mobile, I can insert what we call a button group. Now, if you saw before when I wrote a button group, I had to write a button group, go inside of that element, write a button, set the color to pink, put some text in it. I had to create another button, set the color to transparent. It wasn't a huge amount of work, but it was pretty tedious. Whereas in Sketch, it's a lot more straightforward because we've got these higher level groupings of things ready to go. Because obviously that whole workflow just would not work in Sketch. Like in a tool like Sketch, you need to have a more concrete, complete example. So in this case, we've got our pink and transparent. That was the one I used, that effectively what I built. So if I use the mobile version of this, you can see I kind of got that layout that I had to hard code myself. It's already been defined for me in Sketch, which is, even as a developer, that's much a nicer experience. And I can change the text over here. I can say button 1 is submit and button 2 is cancel. And that was much nicer. But there's no reason we can't have effectively the same model just in code, where if I put the cursor somewhere in that set of code and I say, I want to insert a button group, I should be able to open a pane with pre-canned examples like what we saw in Sketch. And when I say that's the one I want, it should dump the code right where I put the cursor. So it's starting I guess the mental model I'm trying to go for is, again, think of it as a design tool. Even though it's code, how do we bring these things that we take for granted in design tools into this environment and see where it takes us? Where are we? Here we go. Now, this is where it starts to get, I think, really interesting in terms of where we could take it. At the moment, it's just these static pictures, effectively, you're creating. Even though it's in code and it's in the browser, they're just static. I'm really interested to explore how we can start to actually introduce application state to this, so that you can, so as you type in the field, you're actually storing that information somewhere and you can redisplay it somewhere else. You can have logic if you need to. Obviously, this is a bit more extreme in the case of like you're actually trying to prototype with it and not just create visual designs. But I think it's actually doable in a way that the code wouldn't be too intimidating even for non-developers, but we'll see. And I guess once you start going down that road, people also are interested in, again, what you expect from a traditional prototyping tool, which is the ability to create multiple screens, the ability to route between them. And I think there's a way to try and bridge these two worlds together where it doesn't feel like a developer tool. It does feel like a design tool. It just happens to be using code. So just to sort of show you roughly what's in my head as best I can. No, sorry, yeah. So this is pretty sparse at the moment, but I see no reason that there couldn't effectively be like a tab strip at the top of this code pane, where what I'm looking at here is the default screen, my initial screen, but I should be able to click a plus and just have another code pane show up, and I can give it a name. I can say it's the login screen, so I can have the sign in or the login screen. And then I could just have a function available to me called go to screen, and I just tell it which of these screens that I've defined do I want to go to. So I could have a button here, this cancel, for example. I could put an on click that says go to screen. Obviously it doesn't work because this is just in my head. Go to screen, what was this, a sign in? We could go to a register, if that's what we were creating, right? So as long as I had another tab there that I'd named register, that could work. And it's not too intimidating as a piece of code. It's literally just a little function called tell us where you're going. So I think there's a lot of potential for that sort of thing as well. The idea, just to reiterate, really, what I'm exploring here is trying to create like my vision of what a different type of design tool could be in this world of design systems. I'm really interested in this idea of treating JSX as a first-class design language, not just for developers, but for designers as well. I am trialing this with actual designers. Once I got the autocomplete in there the other day, the first thing I did was get a visual designer to try typing stuff out in JSX, and she got the hang of it really fast. Like I was actually really surprised. I was excited. I was really excited. There was a few things I had to go, yeah, I probably should have given you a bit more of a primer on how JSX works, but she actually got like 80% of it, and I just had to just teach her a few of the quirks along the way, but it was pretty easy. Definitely the sort of thing you could easily run a workshop on and have people up to speed quickly, like honestly. There's definitely a lot of potential there, like I alluded to, where JSX I think is actually a really good prototyping language. A lot of this is because of the power of tools like React. It's so much more, it's so much easier to work in the UI than it used to be. And if you've got a design system behind you, it's that much easier again. So I think the opportunity to explore this space is really surprising to me, how there's actually not a lot of work happening in this space. But again, what I'm really focused on is trying to create this shared language between design and development. And I think that this tool is starting to show the potential of, again, JSX as that shared language of components and their properties expressed as code. There's a lot of potential there. So the perennial question, of course, is always, should designers learn to code? I never try to answer this question. I like to pose the question though. But I think one of the problems I have with this question is that code is such a broad concept. Like, code means a million things to different people. And as someone who codes for a living, like, there's only like a subset of a type of code that I write. Like, code is just such a broad umbrella. I think that there's room for us to be a little more specific here when we ask this question. And I'd like to pose to you tonight the question of, should designers learn to code JSX? Just that. And I actually think that that's not a crazy question to ask. So again, like I said, I'm keen to hear what your thoughts on that. I realize it's a big question. These tools are early, but they're starting to explore how possible is this as an idea. But I'm really pushing this idea of coding at the speed of design, getting coders and designers to work together in the final medium, using a shared language, not trying to abstract each other's work away, but actually work on that final medium together. And let's see where it takes us. Hopefully it's a journey you'll join me on, and I'd love to hear what you think. That's it for me. Thank you for listening. Do I do questions now?
Awesome. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks. So yeah, I have sort of two questions. When you were showing us how you were coding and it was designing at the same time, well, I've not seen that myself, but where did you define the elements when you started coding and it started populating the screen? Where did you define like the typography and the spacing, like the basic CSS sort of elements?
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess to step back, one of the challenges is that for this to even be a possibility, you first have to have a good component system. This is something that a lot of companies are actively working on now. Until you have that, this is a bit of a pipe dream, because it's like, what am I typing here? In large part, I think this is why this is only now starting to become a conversation we can have, is because, so if I go myself back in my career, 5 years ago, where I didn't have a component system, all I had was just raw HTML and CSS and copying, pasting stuff around. It was a real mess. We weren't operating at a high enough level for this to even be possible. So in our case, just to more directly answer your question, if I go look at Seek Style Guide, this is our documentation here. I'll get this out of the way. And so these are all of our components here. And so you've got things like an alert defines the different states that it's in. You can say where it's positive or info or critical, primary, secondary, tertiary. All of this exists in our, bear with me, in our open source style guide repository. And so this is a centralized place where developers across Seek, they consume this, they contribute to it themselves. And we work with designers as much as we can to try and capture the way they think about these components and build them in this spot. So we were looking before at the alert. So I can drill down here into React, into alert. Now each component locally within that folder has the JavaScript, which contains, because we're using JSX, I was talking about before, you can see there's a section there. So that's, what's the markup for it? Up here is the behavior. So what happens when I interact with this thing? This being an alert, there's not a whole lot of interaction. And then in terms of the visual styling, there's a style sheet next to it, which has only the styles for that alert. So we don't have these sort of global sprawling styles that touch everything. We're trying, like I talked about earlier, we're trying to make sure that our UI is built up of components that can be recombined in the way that you've seen, and everything they need is scoped locally to it. But there's a lot of work that goes into one of these systems. There are open source ones that you can use if you're trying to save time. We've found historically the issue with Seek with those is that you have to have buy-in from designers and developers. We've had problems where developers have gone, hey, this will make us go faster, and the designers really don't know anything about it. Bootstrap was that for us. The designers didn't think in Bootstrap. The developers were trying to code it in Bootstrap, and it was like, we were speaking different languages, didn't work. That's why I think most companies end up having to build their own, but yeah, it's a big job, unfortunately.
Thanks.
So my question is about that. I think as a designer, sometimes that we kind of want to push the design further and like challenge existing component. And so do you, so from my understanding from your talk that you need to make into the code base and then you use it and able to prototype or like put together a layout rapidly with the system. So is there a way that you would recommend for a designer working your team that something like a variation or even a really different component, how it could work with this system?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we definitely struggle with a little bit is, I think historically, because we haven't worked this way and our workflows haven't really evolved fully to deal with it yet, one of the challenges we find is that there's kind of like, I find that the design process, there's often kind of these two big modes you flip between. So one is what I'm designing is more or less a standard page. I want it to look like every other page. I'm not trying to reinvent the world. I'm just trying to build a sign up form for this new product we're building. And it's not trying to look revolutionary. It's not trying to look different. The other sort of mode that you might flip into is, I actually want to make, so in our case, I want to make Seek look better, just in general. So what is stopping us from looking as good as we could look? How can we improve that? And what sort of broad changes can I make to the system to uplift the whole ecosystem? And like I said, I think because our workflows haven't really evolved to deal with design systems as well as they could, one of the I would say one of the challenges is often designers tend to do both of those things at once. So they kind of go, look, I've designed a new sign-up form. By the way, I've reinvented Seek while I was at it. And it's like, well, hang on. I kind of can't easily do these two things at once. Like, if you want me to make it look like every other page, I can do that easily. If you want me to go to the component library and make it look 10, 20, 30% better, assuming we have buy-in from the other designers, we can do that. But what I can't do is kind of ship a page tomorrow that is a total reinvention. Like the two kind of don't go together. And so I think it's really just a case of designers in this world need to be a little more deliberate about which of these modes am I in, and not trying to do them both at the same time. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Pass it down.
Thank you. Hi, Mark. My question is, if there were people in your team on different things discussing changes to an existing component, how does that workflow, like, what does that workflow look like? So from like the conception of the idea all the way to it being revised and then being released and affecting all the production.
You're asking from the initial creation of a component through to its revision, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I guess like even before into code, like the design team's idea to make a existing component better.
Yeah.
And what does that sort of iteration and release process look like?
Yeah, so the making it well, I'll start with one side of it, which is like, if the component doesn't exist at all, that's almost that's the part where you just go almost to your traditional workflow, which is I'm going to open Sketch and I'm going to draw whatever I want effectively, and then I'll run it by other people, whether it's other designers, developers. We'll get a feel for what is this thing, what is it called, where is it useful, like is it actually a pattern, that kind of thing. And then what we try to do is make it so that the first team that designs with that element play a role in building it. So it's not just built kind of in a vacuum and then we hope one day it's useful. We build it in the context of a real product with real value, and part of that means we're measuring it against real users and seeing how well they're using it. So once that's in the code base, that's when, of course, what we showed before with HTML Sketch App, it will loop back into Sketch so that that element that started as kind of a mock-up in Sketch is now actually a rendering of the final code version back into Sketch. So as a designer now, I'm pulling that element into Sketch and I'm using that in my future designs. But I mean, we talked about earlier the example of the text area where I might want to change the way, well, I'll show you that concrete example, right? So I'm going to undo my changes. So here was my text area. And this is actually a real scenario we've had, where a designer might look at this and say, so this is actually a countdown of how many characters you have remaining. And a designer might actually find that at the point at which they use this, they don't like it. They disagree somewhat with the implementation. And often what will happen is when they raise that, the people will respond like, yeah, this was a first cut. Like we're not huge fans of it. It did the job. It's out there, it's being used. It's not bad. It's just, it was our first cut. And so the designer might say, okay, first of all, I'm not sure that we need to show 500. Like that seems like you don't need to know yet that there's 500 characters remaining. Like then we start to have these conversations. So this is one of the challenges again with a tool like Sketch, is it doesn't really capture the full interactivity. So what you might not get here is a sense of how does it behave as I type? Are there animations as it starts to count down? In our system, it actually changes color once it goes to a negative number. So it tries to look more like an error, all these sorts of things. So what will happen then is that someone will we have a visual design catch-up. We also have UX catch-ups as well. But it's largely a visual design effort, this project. The designer will suggest the change, and they'll kind of be asked to do the legwork of saying, okay, where else is this component used? Can you make the same change in all those places and just make sure that this change is actually a change that suits everyone? It's not just for your page. And so they'll present that. They'll say, here's my suggestion. Here's what it looks like in all these scenarios where it's being used. And then they're just trying to get some broad consensus. Like, do we all agree that this is a step forward for the system? Often if they've done the hard work, right, and they've actually gone and checked it and they've made sure that it looks good, it tends to be an easy yes for people. They go, yeah, that looks like an obvious improvement. And then they'll just kind of get a developer on their team or whoever's available to build out that change. Does that fully answer the question? Yeah, cool.
Hey, Mark. So when you're going through the prototyping process there, and you're off by heart, the props that you're going to enter onto the component there, with the testing internally at Seek potentially, or with whoever you're testing with, have you kind of noticed gaps in your documentation around the kind of the UX side of it? In terms of me being a designer, where would I go to find out those props? So my question is mainly around the usability of your docs.
Yeah, it's a good question. Our documentation is nowhere near as good as it could be. That said, I'm also very skeptical that people read documentation. People say they want it and then they don't read it, I think is often what happens. I'm a big believer in getting the information in line where people need it at the time they need it and not some sort of parallel system. I actually think in a lot of ways, our Sketch library is the documentation for a lot of designers, because what it tells you, right, is right here in the context of my design flow, what is in the design system, what's it called, what are the different states, what do those states look like? I don't have to go to a website and then navigate through a menu and then, and so it actually got a lot more usage once we put it in Sketch. So when we're talking about Playroom, let's see if I can get back to it. So your point about sort of testing, when I gave this to one of our visual designers and got her to ever play with it, the auto suggest went a long way to solving this problem. It's not perfect, but it went a long way to solving the biggest problem we had before, which was you literally had to remember. Just there was zero guidance otherwise. The fact that she could kind of, and this is what I saw, I'll try and recreate roughly what she was doing. She would kind of do this, and then she was sort of just browsing the list, and she was, if we've done our job well capturing designers, the design language in code, she's not seeing a bunch of developer jargon, she's actually seeing our agreed upon design language. So she was, she would do something like I think she might have put a card and then put some text in it. And so she did that, and then she wasn't sure what to do. Well, this one's pretty easy. Like, so again, like I said, if we've done our job capturing it, a lot of it is quite self-explanatory. One feature that I'm not making use of here is that this auto-suggest actually supports descriptions as well. I don't know how well that works or not. The other thing that one of the developers raised today when I talked about this was some of these are, not in this case, but some of these properties are often mandatory and others are optional. there's no communication of that. So we could start to add those things. If we start to give a little bit more inline feedback about, here are the things you have to provide, and here's a little explanation of what they are and what values we expect, the need for a separate documentation starts to drop away. The other question then starts to be, yeah, okay, you've given me these like micro components, but what about these higher level, like common groupings of things? That's why I talked earlier about this sort of snippet pain of like, yeah, can you give me like a snippet of a basic form? Because I can't, off the top of my head, I'm not gonna remember what a form is made out of. But if you can literally dump like a standard form with one checkbox, one radio, one text field, I can start to manipulate it. It's a bit more straightforward. Now, none of that's going to be absolutely perfect. There is still going to be that learning curve there. But in some ways, I think like that learning curve is part of the point to a degree. It's to try and get designers to not think of this as someone else's problem, and actually like it is a shared language we should all learn. And if it's hard to learn, like we should actually change it. Like, because if it's hard to learn for designers, it's probably hard to learn for developers as well. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get to with this.
Yeah, it's a good point with like sketches making prompts like accessible like through the UI. So like you probably make a good assumption that I type a label here, it needs to be in this format. I add in the text, there it is.
Yeah, the problem that I found in practice was that she would, I can't think of a good example, but it was suggesting things, and she, I think she had something like a checkbox where, no, I can't remember what it was, but anyway, she wasn't sure, she guessed wrong what the thing did. So and so when she typed it out, it didn't have the impact on the screen that she thought it would, and there was really no way for her to know, like, well, what am I doing wrong? If it had a bit more of a human readable description of what this thing is actually trying to achieve, that would have helped. But I think for that kind of user, the snippets would be more useful, which is like, can you give me a sort of more complete, rather than making me type out from scratch the whole thing, like give me a complete snippet that I can then edit. It's a lot easier to edit a pre-existing component than to write from scratch.
Hi, I think setting up all the design library and system at the start of a project, that would be ideal. But a lot of cases in practice, that's not happening really a lot. So since design system is really required as the project getting matured, so there are a lot of cases we have to replace existing code which is tangled around with the specific feature on the page on the screen. So I guess you went through a lot of trials and errors, and I'm curious about kind of some advice when situation is like that in terms of do's and don'ts.
Yeah. I could talk for like 30 minutes about that one. So maybe if you want to talk to me afterwards, I'd love to. But I guess the short version of that might be something like, so a lot of technologies come along that the first time you see them, they seem big and scary and like, oh, you'd only use that if you're Facebook or something, right? It's way too futuristic. But all too quickly, these things not only become the norm, but they become things we use on the most mundane of projects. Like we get used to the stuff really quickly. And then because what happens is you try it and then you quickly realize, I actually can't live without this now. Like, it's not just for these big projects. Like if I go back to a small project and I don't have it, I'm going to be less productive. Like I need to bring this new technology forward. And that's why technology is always evolving so fast. And so for me, React particularly and component libraries built on top of that technology in general are something that even for the most simple of sites, I find myself not wanting to let go of this paradigm. And so I guess the relevance here is that if I was to go and create a startup tomorrow, some people might think, oh, surely it'd be faster, right? To not go through all this effort and to just do it the old way. I actually disagree now. Like now that I've got used to it, I think there's a little bit of a misconception with components, which this sort of component system, which is it's only useful at scale. I think that's where it's most immediately useful, most obviously useful. But as you can see, I think with what I'm doing here, for me, the bigger benefit of them, which you sort of find out after you get used to it, is the speed of iteration. It's the fact that you've seen what I'm doing here. I can quickly spin up new screens, recombine things, rearrange things at a speed that I just could not do when I did it the old easy way. Like it was actually one of those things that seems easy, but quickly you create something that if you want to change your mind, it's really hard. It's really hard. With this, it's very easy for me to change my mind. If I create a form and a designer comes to me and says, actually, I changed my mind about how this form works, in this world, I'm like, yeah, no worries, cool. If you said that to me, 4 years ago, I'm going, I just spent like days on that. Are you serious? And so I think that's really what we're trying to get to. And so, I don't know, you asked about do's and don'ts. I guess the do's would be, don't underestimate how, don't underestimate how useful this is at whatever scale you're operating at and however sort of early or far you are in your journey, and that getting these foundations right doesn't have to take that much extra time, but it pays off very quickly. And so even for at big companies, the usefulness is definitely the scale, but at younger companies or younger projects, the usefulness is at, like I said, the speed of iteration. So I don't know how well that answers your question, but there you go.
Awesome. We might hold it there for now. Yeah, please thank Mark.